Hi everyone, welcome. As you're coming in, feel free to share your name and where you're from in the chat. Today, as you know, is the day before Election Day, so we also ask you to share if you voted already, or if not, what is your voting plan, and what steps are you taking to encourage others to vote? We'll take about a minute or two to let people in from the waiting room and introduce themselves in the chat. I see Lisa from Wisconsin voted by mail. Great, Lisa. I'm in DC and I dropped off my ballot in a drop box at a library. DC makes it really easy for us. Denise from Boise voted early. Andres from Miami voted by mail. Ella from South Carolina voted early. Lisa from Michigan voted by mail. John from Brooklyn voted early. Oh, they're coming in very fast. It's great to see such a wide range of voting options. We'll give it another 30 seconds or so as people come in from the waiting room. Feel free to continue introducing yourselves, where you're from, whether you voted or you're planning to vote tomorrow or later today. I'm also seeing some people who have volunteered. That's great to hear. All right, well, I think the entrance from the waiting room is slowing down, but of course, feel free to continue introducing yourselves in the chat and sharing your voting plan or whether you voted already and how you voted in the chat throughout the webinar. We'll go ahead and dive right into things. For those of you who are new to the webinar series, my name is Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the project manager of NLIHC's Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. Happy Election Day Eve. I don't know if that's a thing people say, but I'm going to say it. So happy Election Day Eve, and thank you so much for choosing to spend your afternoon before Election Day with us on our second to last Our Homes, Our Votes 2024 webinar. Our topic today is overcoming voter suppression and building confidence in elections. And if you're tuning into the webinar series for the first time today, I encourage you to check out the archive of our past webinars on our website. We've had 14 webinars up until today. There's been a lot of wisdom shared from many panelists and many attendees as well. So again, feel free to keep introducing yourselves in the chat as you're going along and to engage with each other in the chat regarding your voting plans. We can go on to, then actually, no, we're on the correct slide. Sorry about that. So just to give a framing of what we'll discuss today, deliberate voter suppression tactics, such as restrictive voter ID laws, tend to disenfranchise members of the same communities that are at disproportionate risk of housing insecurity and homelessness. Misinformation about the voting process can also discourage voters from casting their ballots, and survivors of domestic violence can face a unique set of barriers to voting safely and comfortably. This webinar will cover ways that you can empower community members to overcome these obstacles to the ballot box, understand the voting process, and go into Election Day with confidence. It's an honor to introduce Kat Calvin, the founder and executive director of Spread the Vote / Project ID, CJ Coles, the deputy director of legislative affairs at Verified Voting, and Lindsay Dearlove, global director of operations at the No More Project. I'll also just give a note that today's webinar does touch upon the difficult subject of domestic violence. And we're really grateful to have Lindsay here with us from No More to speak about safe voting for survivors. We also know this topic is very personal and can be painful for some to hear about. So if tuning out or logging off is appropriate for you at any point, we completely understand that and always prioritize what you need to do to take care of yourselves. So we'll have our presentations, we'll have Q&A at the end, and then just a few closing announcements about what you can continue to do to be involved with Our Homes, Our Votes. So before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. We'll send out the recording and the links that are shared in the chat in this week's edition of our Friday email newsletter, The Connection, and the recording will be posted on the NLIHC YouTube channel by the end of the week. We also have closed captioning enabled. Thank you so much to our captioner for being here today and for all your hard work. Please ask questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. With so many people attending and such lively conversation in the chat, it can be harder to catch the questions for the panelists, so we're more likely to notice them if you share them in the Q&A. Speaking of the chat, we ask that everyone engage thoughtfully and respectfully and live by the platinum rule, which is to treat others the way they want to be treated, even if that's different from the way that you want to be treated. And last but not least, a reminder that Our Homes, Our Votes is 100% nonpartisan, meaning that we don't endorse or favor specific candidates or political parties. Our goal is to build the voting power of low-income renters so we can hold all elected officials accountable to prioritize housing justice. And with that, I will pass it along to Kat to get us started.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Kat Calvin. I'm, as you can see on the slide, founder and ED of Spread the Vote and Project ID. What we do year-round through Project ID, we help people get government-issued photo ID. 26 million American adults do not have ID, which they need for a variety of things, as well as you all know, housing. So we both directly help people get all the documents that they need for their IDs, get to the DMV, et cetera, do whatever we can to get an ID in their hands. But we also work with organizations and agencies across the country, training them and helping them to set up their own ID operations to be able to help their clients and communities get IDs. And sneak preview, because we'll be announcing this on Wednesday, we're also next year launching an incubator to help people who want to start their own ID organizations have a year-long intensive program to be able to help them do that. So our goal generally is just to close that ID gap. During elections, we also, through Spread the Vote, do a lot of voter education and turnout work. We have a program called Vote by Mail in Jail, which is the only national program to help incarcerated voters vote. We were in 60 plus jails this year across the country. And so we do programs like that. We've done a lot of work this year helping the Navajo Nation be able to get out the vote and working with our clients and communities who are unhoused and at risk around the country. So that is what we do. And I was asked to give some last minute GOTV tips about what you can do to help get out the vote in these last little more than 24 hours. And there are actually a lot of things, although we are moving more towards having an early voting season, which I love and which we need. We do not need Election Day to be a federal holiday. We need long voting seasons, which we have in pretty much every state now. But still, a lot of people vote on Election Day or turn in their last minute ballots because they forgot to mail, even though they've been sitting on their kitchen tables for the last 3 weeks. Until tomorrow. And so there are several things that you can do either for yourself, or I know that a lot of you have communities, tenants, even families, et cetera, who are working to vote. And when we're thinking about Election Day voting, there's a couple of things that come up. One is just the ability to get to the polls. Transportation is always a challenge, particularly for folks who are in rural areas, in areas that don't have a lot of public transportation, if they don't have their own transportation, et cetera. And so one of the things that we try to do and encourage folks to do is just make sure that anyone you are talking to about voting actually has a way to get to the polls. And whether it's that they need help with a bus pass or they need a ride, or we often end up doing last minute finding ADA accessible transportation for folks, I'm really thinking about making sure that when we're talking to people about voting, we're talking to them about having the capacity and capability to actually be able to do that is really important. And so as you're talking to your tenants and your folks, that is a really key question to ask is, can you actually get to the polls? And if not, let's figure out how you can do that. The other thing that people have to do is be sure that they are turning in their ballots. Every state has different rules. We have a website, I'll put it in the chat. It's called readtheeffingdirections.com. And it is all about how to vote by mail appropriately. Every state has different rules about, does it have to be postmarked on Election Day by a certain time, by 4 p.m., by 7 p.m., et cetera, the day before Election Day. it's different for everybody. And so it's really important that you know what those rules are in your state, so that if you're talking to someone at 10 a.m. and they're like, oh yeah, I have to mail in my ballot, that you know, well, you need to have it mailed in the mailbox by 4 or by 7, or what those particular rules are. So do a quick check for your state. You can go on readtheeffingdirections.com, or really, if you just, at this point, if you Google, even Google is just giving you the answer because everyone's asking, or ask Chat GPT. But be sure that you know exactly sort of what those little rules are. When you're talking to folks too, one thing that people, particularly young people, forget all of the time is to sign the back of their envelope when they're turning in their ballot. And especially, if they mailed it in 3 weeks ago, they could get a call from the county clerk and come in and fix it. If they mail it in tomorrow, they do not have that chance. And so making sure that they're paying attention to what all those little rules are, which are usually the reason that people get their ballots thrown out. And young people are 5 times more likely to get their ballots thrown out. People of color are 3 times more likely. And a lot of times it's because if they are first-time voters, if they are voting by mail for the first time. Also, a lot of states have created extra rules, like you have to include a picture of your ID or your driver's license number, right? Or all these different things. So when you're helping someone fill out their ballot, especially because if it's election day, there's a lot of panic because you got to get it done today. Be sure that you know what the little rules are in your state so that you can advise them appropriately. The other thing that is important to know is whether or not your state is a same-day registration state. 21 states plus DC actually have same-day voter registration. So they can go to the polls if they're not registered, register right there and vote right there. So do a check, find out if your state is one of those 21 states or if you're in DC. And that way you can advise someone if they say, oh my God, I didn't even register. You can say, you know what? That's okay. You're in California. You can go to the polls and you can register and vote today. And so that's fantastic news. Hopefully we can get that up to 50 states or more in the future. But right now we have almost half the states where you can register same day. That's especially helpful for folks who are more at risk. Our organization, we work with a lot of unhoused folks, and in Los Angeles, where I live part-time, I kind of just moved, but there are 2 polling places in Skid Row where our folks can go and register and vote that same day in person, which is really important if you are unhoused. And so knowing whether or not your state has these rules particularly helps folks who are often the folks we're working with who don't have the luxury of preparation, or of getting timely mail or different things like that. So do a quick check, see what your state's rules are so that when people ask, you can know the answer. Also, because it is impossible for any of us to know all the answers, there is an organization that does. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, they are always one of my favorite organizations, but during elections, they're incredible. Their phone number, 866 our vote, like tattoo it on your forehead. Any questions that you may have tomorrow or today, or even after the election, if you have anybody who is having challenges at the polls, who is being rejected, who you don't think should be, any issues at all, call 866 our vote. They are super staffed with lawyers on election day. They are there to answer questions. They are there to do rapid response. They are there to be able to support you when you have problems on election day. So that, if you remember nothing else, remember that number, tell everyone that number. And if there is any issue or any question you don't know the answer to, call the Lawyers Committee, 866 our vote. They are so good. And I think you can even, I'm old, but I'm pretty sure you can text them now. They're also, the website, I think, is 866ourvote.com or org or something. But, so you can text them, call them, but they are my absolute favorite election day emergency resource. This is what they do, and they do it really, really well. The last thing, and you hear it all the time, back when Twitter was Twitter, who knows, tomorrow they'll probably be pretending that election day is November 8th, but remind people to stay in line. We've had unbelievable record early voting turnout, which we can see because everyone in the chat early voted. But there will be a lot of people who are showing up to vote tomorrow, and there will be really long lines. And it's so, so important to remind people to stay in line. I know we say it every election and you think people know, but people don't know, or people get tired or whatever. And it is cold. I mean, I'm in Arizona and it's freezing here. So we got to move election day to like June. But at the moment, it's November. It's a terrible time for elections. There are long lines. Remind people to stay in line. And if you and your organization or sort of whatever you're with is trying to think of what are last minute ways that we can help, look for the polling places that are closest to your housing unit or your organization, and be there to support folks, to talk to folks, order pizza. If you really want to support and help people, if you're in Georgia, don't do any of those things because you'll go to jail. But in every other state, including Texas, take water, take pizza, be there. We have this program called Comfort at the Polls, and it really is just about making sure that people know that they can stay. There are often people, particularly in certain areas, that will try to intimidate people or will try to tell them, oh, it's 7:01, you have to get out of line, and etc. And there are also a lot of people and a lot of organizations that are going around to polls and making sure that they're supporting people and that they know what their rights are. But you can always be part of helping to make sure that people know to stay in line and that they're being supported while they are in line. And really, I think that is, oh, pizza to the polls is so great. It's the best idea ever. Any organization involving pizza, I'm all for it. I'm what really the top thing, and I'll close with this, for thinking about people who are going to the polls today and tomorrow, is really just thinking about how can you make sure they have the best information, make sure they can get there, and make sure they can stay there. We often will have people who have little kids and they can't carry them, and then we have volunteers who are just the sweetest little old ladies, and they'll just like watch their kids while they're at the polls or things like that. So as you're thinking about your communities and how you can support, just being there to listen, being there to help answer questions, and being there to help them problem solve is huge, and helping them do that as early in the day as possible, so they're not in line until late. But the communities we serve also are often, sorry if you can hear my dog, he's mad that he's not in here. The communities we serve often face a lot of different challenges, right? I mean, everything from, if they are working, if they have a boss who lets them leave, they may only have 2 hours or this or that. And so whatever you can do to be there to help support them. And really critical, to not shame folks if they can't vote. It's really hard for some folks, and we talk all the time about you have to vote and it's your voice and blah blah blah, and that's true. But there are some people for whom realistically they can't overcome all of the challenges to get to the polls. And I think it's really important that we make sure that we are being as accepting and kind to those folks as possible, partially because that's just the right thing to do, partially because we don't want them to feel so bitter about the process that they don't try to vote in the next election if we're lucky to have one. And so it's really critical that we help folks try to solve their problems, but that we also assure them that it's okay if this year maybe they just can't. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Kat. Really appreciate all of the inspiration and guidance around what we can do in these 24 hours, and all of the work that you're doing to get out the vote and support people throughout the year and beyond. All right, I'm gonna pass it over to CJ.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if technology is in my favor today. Hopefully you can all see that. Courtney, is that popping up? Is that good?
Yep, looks good.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, first of all, thank you, Courtney, and this coalition for inviting me and Verified Voting to be here today. And Kat, great presentation and great information for everyone to remember as we head into tomorrow and the days that follow tomorrow, right? So a little bit about me and my organization. So Verified Voting, we're a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization. And we are a voting rights organization, though we kind of have a little bit of a niche in the market, as it were. So who is Verified Voting? Our mission is to strengthen democracy for all voters by promoting the responsible use of technology in our elections. So we were founded in 2004 by a group of computer scientists who had some concerns about emerging election technology at that time. So we've been around for 20 years, and we're really focused on sort of the ecosystem of election administration, right? The nuts and bolts of conducting an election, and what happens to your ballot as it enters that ecosystem. So that's why why I was invited here today, was to talk more broadly about election security and what happens with your ballot as it enters that election administration ecosystem, and why you can have confidence that your ballot will be counted once it enters that ecosystem. And a little bit about me and why I'm here is I'm a former election director. I was an election director for a mid-sized county in the state of Oregon for a period of time. Oregon is all vote by mail, right? So we conducted our elections that way, though you could show up and cast your mail ballot in person, though at only one polling location, and that was the county election office. But we were all vote by mail, right? Like I said, all vote by mail state. And so I have experience in conducting elections and have some knowledge about what goes into counting the ballots and reporting the results. So why can you have confidence that your ballot will be cast? Well, first of all, because of the ballot handling procedures that are required in each and every state, right? There are strict protocols from once that ballot is either mailed to the voter or is given to the voter at a polling location. There's strict protocols in place on how that ballot is handled, what happens to that ballot, and how it is secured so that it is counted as the voter cast. You probably have heard this term, and you'll hear it probably a lot in the next 48 hours, chain of custody, right? What does that mean? That is the process by which once the voter receives their ballot, the processes and procedures that are in place to ensure that the voter gets the ballot, they vote it, and then once they enter it back into the ecosystem, however they do that, either mailing it back, dropping it off in a drop box, showing up and voting in person, what the procedures and processes are to ensure that nothing happens to that ballot that should not happen. There are checklists that have to be signed off on, literal checklists where the check marks have to go. Election workers have to sign paperwork once a ballot is transferred from location to location. Maybe it goes from a precinct, right, and then heads to the central count location, perhaps, right? There's paperwork that goes along with those ballots that are being moved from one place to the other. And all of this documentation is required to be a part of essentially that election, right? Once the election is over, if sort of inspections or post-election audits need to take place, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But the chain of custody records all need to be examined and all need to, line up that the processes and procedures as outlined either in law and or regulation were followed appropriately. And if not, what remedies, right? How is that going to be remedied? There's processes upon processes upon processes in place in every election office across this country, backups to the backups to the backups, right? And so that's what chain of custody refers to, is just all of that put together to protect your vote, to protect your ballot. Another reason you can be confident that your ballot will be counted as cast and will be secure is voting system testing. Every jurisdiction across the country participates in what's called logic and accuracy testing, and that is a test prior to the election where a bunch of test ballots have been marked and they are run through the system to verify that the system will produce what is on, right? The results will mirror what's on the ballots, right? As they're put through. So the test decks, the election officials already know what the outcome is supposed to be because they're test ballots, put them through the system. Does the system count the ballots the same way that they were marked, right? So and a whole bunch of scenarios take place. There are a lot of test ballots that go through this process because in an election, any scenario is possible, right? Any candidate can win, any measure can pass or fail, right? It's up to the voters. And so they go through a whole bunch of scenarios. And that's before the election. After the election, Same thing happens. They run through a whole bunch of test decks to make sure that test ballots to make sure that the system functioned and is still functioning the way that it's supposed to. I put a link there. I'm not going to click on this link, but I think my presentation will be hopefully sent out, and you can click on that link. But the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, which is the federal commission that assists election jurisdictions across the country, have put out some recent videos about election security. I encourage you, if you have questions, to check out their video series, and one of those videos will be linked in this presentation. Okay, another reason you can trust that your ballot will be cast and counted, or be counted as cast: transparency and observation, right? The elections belong to us, the people, right? We're voting and we're deciding what sort of government representation we want and how we want our government to function to serve us, the people. Election processes are open to the public. And so across the country, just as there are 50 different sets of election rules and laws and how you do it, there are 50 different sets of how the transparency and observation works, right? It's not everyone can just show up and you can have 100,000 people in the election office observing everything, because the election office is not an arena, it's not a football stadium. And so there might be limitations on how many people can be in there at a certain time, or how many members of the general public can be inside watching, versus those that might be appointed by the parties or the candidates, or if there's a measure, a representation from who's for and against a ballot measure, right? But every office does have some form of way in which the public can be there in person observing. In addition to that, a lot of jurisdictions, mainly larger jurisdictions across the country, have installed cameras in their election offices to monitor, if it's mail balloting, right, monitoring the process to open the ballots, right, and get the ballots from open out of the envelope and into the scanner, the tabulation equipment, various different areas of election offices. So if you're interested in what's happening at your election office and you happen to live in a jurisdiction that has live video, I encourage you to pull up that video. If you need something to fall asleep to, those are great videos to watch, because the election administration is it's boring, right? I was an election director. It's boring, right? You're processing these ballots, you're getting them into tabulation equipment, right? You're doing math, you're counting. I mean, that's what it is at the election administration point, right? It's not politics in election administration. It's processes, but if you have that opportunity and you're interested, please take advantage of those opportunities. Also, the records in which we have in our elections. The United States has really, over the course of the last 12 years, has moved away from relying too much on election technology, and starting to swing back towards paper ballots and physical records, right, in which can be inspected. Now, there are some voters that cannot mark a paper ballot. And so across the country, there are assistive machines, that technology that help those voters to mark those ballots. I put these two screenshots here on the slide. These are from our website, verifiedvoting.org. We maintain a map and a database, as you can see there, and I'll click on this one just so you can see. We call it the verifier. We track election equipment and processes across the entire country. And you can, let's take Texas here. You can click on a state and you can drill down into every county. And there are 254 counties in Texas. But if you're interested in what election equipment is being used in a specific county, yours or any other county across the country, you can go to our verifier and you can click on the state, click on the county, and you can see what kind of equipment is being used. We also have the stoplight, right? You can see green, yellow, and red on this map of Texas that indicates equipment type, which you can see down here. And the state had 12.4% of the state will have primarily hand-marked paper ballots. a vast majority of the state, 82%, will have ballot marking devices, which is those assistive devices. But in those yellow counties, if you can see that, it's ballot marking devices for all voters, right? So again, if you're interested and you want to see what's happening across the country, I'll plug that from my organization so you can see sort of what type of equipment is being used. But for a vast majority of the country, as you can see here, about 70% of the country hand mark paper ballots. We can physically examine those records. And then post-election audits. Here's another reason why you can trust that your vote will be counted as cast once your ballot enters that ecosystem. 45 states in the country conduct some form of post-election audit to verify the results. Right, they're examining that paper that I was talking about, or examining the machines, and they're ensuring that a good number of those ballots, right, they match up with the reported results. Verified Voting as an organization, we endorse what's called a risk limiting audit, RLA. Those are considered the most robust audits by a slew of organizations, federally and nonprofit as well. And if you want to learn more about that, I've embedded a video link here once you get that, if you want to learn about that type of post-election audit. And also Verified Voting, we maintain a database of every state's voting or post-election audit laws, and that's updated regularly as new legislation is passed. So if you're interested, what does your state do? How do they check the count? What's that audit look like? You can go to our website, look up your state, and you'll find exactly how a post-election audit is conducted in your state or jurisdiction. And then lastly, as Kat plugged, I'll also plug the Election Protection Coalition. Verified Voting is a part of that coalition. Kat talked about, lawyers being staffed. One of our lawyers on our staff is in the thick of answering election protection calls and has been doing that for the last several weeks, right, as early voting has gotten underway. So yeah, any questions that you have, if you have a concern about something you're seeing at your election office, call. You can text Kat, so you can text that number, and then there's their website, right? 866ourvote.org. So they're there right now, many hours of the day, and they will be there many hours and many days after the election takes place. So if you have any questions, concerns, give them a call. They want to hear from you if you have those questions. Also, I will plug, reach out to your local election office should you have any specific questions about how your elections are run. Don't trust everything you see on the news. Don't trust everything you see on social media. Your election office, the workers there are your neighbors, your friends, and they're just trying to do their job. And not trying to be political as they actually administer the election, but just trying to follow those processes, those checklists, and make sure that the math is correct. So with that, also you can reach out to us. Here's our contact information should you want to reach out to us. But you can trust that your vote will be counted. Your ballot is safe and secure once it enters that ecosystem, and your ballot will be treated the same way as everybody else's ballot, right? It is blind, so you can trust that your ballot will be counted. And with that, Courtney, I think I'll send it back to you.
Thank you so much, CJ. I appreciate all of this information to instill confidence in our elections and all of the research that you and your colleagues have been doing, and your advocacy year round to make sure that our elections are strong and accessible. I also should note that today is Election Hero Day, which is a nonpartisan civic holiday dedicated to uplifting and celebrating poll workers and election officials. So I think it's a very appropriate time to acknowledge all of the hard and perhaps sometimes boring, but very critical work that goes into our election administration. So thank you to CJ for your service, both as an election worker yourself previously, and in kind of leading this nationwide effort. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Lindsay.
So much, and thank you so much for inviting Know More. A little bit of background about Know More. We're a global organization which is focused on the prevention and and information and awareness around ending domestic and sexual violence. We've been around and predominantly in the US for about 13 years now. You may have seen some of the campaigns we've done, so we're really chuffed to be in this space and being able to chat about this. I do need to give you a bit of a preamble, that fact that I'm based in the UK this evening and Guy Fawkes is tomorrow night, which is when, as you may know, 100 or quite a few years ago, they tried to blow up Parliament. So we're all celebrating by letting off fireworks. So bit of a moment for us to be able to say that. But yeah, so I'm really here to talk about domestic violence or intimate personal violence or stalking and how that can have an impact on people's ability and willingness to vote, and what we can do in a way to support and help those survivors experience and the enjoyment and the actualization of voting. And I think the best place to sort of start is trying to understand why voting can be a scary and daunting prospect. And I suppose in the first instance is that for many victim survivors of domestic abuse, intimate personal violence or stalking, their number one safety measure that they may have been encouraged to take or have taken upon themselves is to keep themselves and their address and their new location completely in confidence. And so they may not have even begun to share that with family and friends, for example, or may not have even, thought about how they're going to start, sharing that publicly. And obviously, if you do register to vote, some of your information is available both, publicly. There are programs, really great programs, and most states offer them. Some of them offer sort of different variations of them, one of them being the address confidentiality program. You can access that. If you don't mind slipping to the next slide. Sorry, Courtney, I forgot to mention that. So many states offer that. It's obviously you can reach out with that via a government official or speaking to a national or local domestic abuse or stalking advocacy agency. But I think there's an aspect of taking the initiative and feeling confident enough to reach out and talk about voting, but also that piece about actually the fear of what will happen if my address leaves my control and somebody else has it, and I'm actually then starting this process. It's incredibly scary, incredibly daunting. And for many survivors of domestic abuse, it could be the number one sort of barrier for being able to vote. So being able to have those early conversations, and it can start as soon as, this week, about voting for next time, securing your address, making sure that person feels safe in that moment and safe about and trusting in the processes which are available. The other thing to consider is that for some, and if not many of those victim survivors who are still living with the abusive partner or have just recently separated, so the risk of significant harm is really high, is that the perpetrator is consistently isolating them from information and potentially community knowledge. So if you are thinking about how do you engage those people who are living in abusive relationships, putting the information around voting in unusual and unlikely spaces can be the real game changer. We dismiss sometimes, and we think we can rely on social media, we can rely on media or people knocking on doors, but if you're not allowed to answer the phone without someone listening to you, you're not going to get that call from that person who's, telling you different party politics or encouraging you to vote. That's not going to be an option for you. If you aren't able to go into a community space or a public space without having your abusive partner with you, they're preventing you from having that. You're not going to be able to pause and look at posters and find out information about how to vote safely, or even start to consider what the different parties are potentially offering or the candidates are offering. So really, we'd always encourage all the different and unusual spaces to talk about voting are often some of the greatest spaces. Going into prenatal groups talking about it is really important, or even then sort of going into women's only safe spaces, for your gynecological visits, for example, or OBGYN. All of those things are really crucial and really helpful, as well as linking with your local domestic abuse, domestic violence shelters and advocacy projects can be really sort of a game changer for many victim survivors. The other thing to consider is that for those living with an abusive person, voting season could be a moment of intense coercive control around choices around voting, the sort of persuasion that can happen or forcing people to vote in a particular way. And so understanding that actually voting and taking up that opportunity to vote could cause significant conflict at home. And if you're trying to do your best to minimize harm and you're managing safety, voting can be a moment where that happens. What you can do if you're concerned about someone you know is obviously offer them support and advice around helplines and hotlines that are available, but also start thinking about like, what does that look like with regards to confidentiality for that person? What options do they have if they're still living with an abusive partner? How can you talk to them safely, and how can you find the different opportunities to do that? Next slide, please. So what are those opportunities in a way? One of them, and sort of we really rely heavily on, which does take a little, quite a bit of pre-planning and a lot of sort of emotional support around that person feeling safe and trusting in the process, is or address confidentiality programs. And as I mentioned previously, you work with a government official or a localized or statewide advocacy agency who can secure your address and remove it. And that just means that you are able to offer a substitute address for voting, and that can be really, really empowering. The other thing to consider is sort of early voting. Thanks to Kat, we can very clearly say 21 states offers it, including DC. That's great, especially if you can, you know, find, sorry, I'm confused. Sorry, same day registration voting is really sort of the changer in it. If you can do it and you can turn up on the day and you have access to your sort of photo ID, and that's not being held back from you by your abusive partner, that can be one of the safer ways to vote, but obviously that's not available to everybody, and that could often depend on your ability to reach that voting space. And if you don't have access to, you know, transport, or your transport is monitored, it can raise concerns. Voting by mail can be helpful, especially if you feel that it can be discreet, but obviously if you feel you're concerned that somebody may intercept your post or have access to it, that could rule out that option for you. So I think there's something really important about really understanding that victim survivors' experience of domestic abuse, domestic violence, intimate personal violence, or stalking before we start really like digging into the suggestions. The other one is in voting in person, and what can that look like? That starts with safety planning. Can you vote at a space where you know that your abusive partner won't be there, or is there an alternative space that you can go to if you feel that you could bump into each other? You know, you've mentioned so eloquently about standing in line, but if you can imagine from a victim survivor's point of view, they're actually in a space where they could be seen by somebody that they know, and they're fixed in that space for a period of time. They don't want to leave the line, but it's creating an intense amount of risk and anxiety and worry. So I think there's something about really understanding what that would mean for a victim survivor before we start to say like, hey, you know, you can vote. Let's really explore that person's individual story and experience. Next slide, please. You know, and we would offer this, and I suppose many people would suggest these, and these are really simple sort of safety planning suggestions, but really caveat that with everybody's experience of domestic abuse, domestic violence, intimate personal violence, or stalking is very uniquely theirs. And actually some of the stalking that an abusive person will do can be so imaginative and so far-fetched that it's hard to, you know, when someone discloses that to you, to really understand how that could impact someone's day-to-day life. So I would always say, allow the person whom is the victim survivor to lead on their decisions around how they would vote safely. But some of our tips would be vote at a time when your abuser is busy. So having, you know, knowing that there's lots of opportunities within a day and you could potentially go to a different voting station can be really important and empowering. You know, we always say do things in partnership with someone that you trust. You know that you're doing this, and it can be very scary, it can be very risky from your understanding around your personal safety. Make sure an advocate knows, you know, go with a trusted family member. All of that stuff is really sort of important. You know, the other thing which is easy to say is plan your safe transport ahead of time. Going on a communal bus can be really useful, but also can be terribly terrifying. You don't know whom may know you or may know your abusive partner, in particular if you've tried to keep your location secret and you know, in confidence from anybody who may have contact with them. And I suppose then the other thing is, and you know, a day before you go to the polls, we've got the polls closed, this is difficult to say, but planning or talking about voting earlier on can be really key. You know, next week when the election results are in and everybody's still considering the sort of what's happened is a great time to really start talking about voting options if you've experienced domestic abuse, domestic violence, or interpersonal violence. And like the other speakers, we have 2 great tools that we've used and we'd love to promote. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Courtney. The first one being our No More State Voting Guide, which has been an incredibly interesting journey of us pooling together all the different options that are available for those that have endured domestic or sexual violence or stalking. It's on the website. It's great to look at, but alongside, many of the resources that CJ and Kat have suggested, it provides a tool for survivors that are specifically written for them. And then the other thing I'd like to suggest is that many of you will be working directly with victims of domestic violence, stalking, or sexual violence, and often faced with, where can I refer somebody to? How can I access advocacy support that is, tailored to their needs or their location? And the Bright Sky app, which is a free to download app, has all of this information. It has a full directory of services for across the US and Canada, as well as healthy relationships quizzes, so a great way to start conversations around what somebody's experiencing, but also a whole host of tips and suggestions about how you can support somebody you're concerned about. So 2 great resources, in addition to the brilliant ones that CJ and Kat have suggested. I know I've sped through that. I'm just conscious of time. I wanted to make sure that we had enough time for questions. So thank you, and I appreciate it. Are you inviting no more?
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you for being here and for all of these really incredible tips. I think a lot for me to think about, a lot of new tips for me to consider as we plan our work for 2025 and beyond. I'm going to dive straight into questions because we've gotten some really good ones. So one question for CJ. We've printed a lot of incredible information, but most of us are not going to become election administration experts or be able to internalize all of that to have readily available in just like an offhand conversation. So what's a 2-sentence elevator pitch that you would give to a potential voter to reassure them that their ballot will be fairly counted?
That is a great question. Uh, I'll sort of answer this kind of in pieces, right? So some things I didn't mention that should be mentioned also are, right, who's working at the election office, right? I mentioned, your neighbors, your friends, right? These are people that live in your community. The processes within the office are done in a bipartisan manner. And so what that means is it's not just all members of one party or all members of another party, right, that are doing the work. Things have to happen in a bipartisan way. You have to have those handling ballots be from different parties. They can't just, do it by themselves, right? So that's one thing, right? And all the processes in place that I talked about, chain of custody, the checks, the balances, right, that have to happen within an office to go from the beginning of the election to the end of the election, right? And if those don't happen, there are remedies in place to ensure that those things happen. I think the biggest thing really that I would say is everybody's ballot is treated the same. In every office across the country, once that ballot enters that ecosystem, like I was talking about, those ballots are treated the same. And it is very, very difficult, even for election administrators, to figure out whose ballot is whose. I mean, it is incredibly difficult to do. And so you can trust that your ballot will be fairly counted because it is treated the exact same as every other ballot, right? And as those processes, as that ballot goes through the different processes, maybe, in an all vote by mail state, maybe the signature doesn't look quite the same as the voter registration file, right? And so you're going to get a message from the election office to, correct that, ensure that that is your ballot and correct that signature, right? So that it can be counted. That's all a part of the process. That doesn't signal fraud. That doesn't signal anything other than the processes are working the way that they are supposed to. So I know that's not a 2-sentence, elevator pitch, but take bits and pieces of that so that you can know that every ballot is treated the same within the ecosystem.
Thank you, CJ. That's super helpful. We have another audience question that I think is directed towards Lindsay, but anyone can feel free to answer if you have advice. So our attendee lives in a vote by mail state and knows someone whose partner intercepts their ballot directly from their mailbox, fills it out, seals the envelope, and forces them to sign it without allowing them to see it, and then mails it off without their input. Are there any steps you'd recommend that they take to protect themselves and their right to vote?
I would start really at the beginning of that sort of, disclosure, is that somebody is living in an abusive relationship. And so maybe having really open conversations with them in a really safe place could enable them to access the support that they need to leave or to move on from that relationship. So I would start there in a way, and obviously allowing safety to lead. I think the challenge is that, it's what can you do in that situation and how can you acknowledge that? I mean, I would, defer to Kat and to CJ about voter fraud and how that they can sort of report on that if they think that is happening. But also from my perspective, and I think from NOMO's perspective, we'd always say there's a survivor there who's at risk of significant harm. And having those questions, and actually this being a great opportunity to talk about them, is really key. And then linking and reaching out to an advocacy agency that is local to where you are can make all the difference. So you're able, as the person who's concerned about someone to reach out, have that conversation. They may suggest different support options that are available that could meet the needs of the person you're concerned about, and in turn enable them to access support. But I'll defer to CJ and Kat about, because it's voter fraud to some degree, what can they do?
If they're concerned about voter fraud, yeah. Again, I know I sound like a broken record. Go to your local election office. Call your local election official. Ask them about the process by which the ballots are secured and by which they work to prevent voter fraud. There are steps in place, I guarantee you, within your local election office for just about every scenario, even this one, where if someone is essentially their ballot has been voted and they're forced to sign, call your local election office, right? If that scenario is that process can happen where maybe that ballot enters the mail. But then I don't know if you're able to privately call at some point your local election official and say, I need to spoil my ballot. I changed my mind and it hasn't been counted yet, right? There are opportunities for a ballot to not enter the system if the voter changes their mind or in this scenario needs their ballot not to enter that system. There are ways in which that can happen. You got to communicate with the local election office, right? And they are there to help you, the voter. I guarantee you, all they want to do is help the voter. And there are things that happen, post-election where ballots are looked at for potential fraud if something is flagged, and an investigation can begin. But I would say if there's an opportunity to communicate with your local election office, please, please, please do that. They really are there to help you.
I would also throw in, and this might be in your voter guide that I'm really excited about. For future elections, most counties offer an option to pick up your mail-in ballot from the county clerk rather than having it sent to your house. They do this a lot for folks who are unhoused or different reasons. So obviously a lot depends on what sort of freedoms or options that this person in this scenario or anyone in this type of scenario has, but there may be an option for them to change the way their ballot is sent, to go to the county clerk, tell them, can I just pick up my ballot from now on, and then find time within whatever sort of space they have during early voting to go and just fill it out at the county clerk's office. So that may also be an option for them.
And I will just end, thank you so much for helping answer that question. But for me, I'm just going to go back to safety, and allowing the person who is in that situation to lead the decision about what happens next, because any sort of shift in what's happening in the home could cause significant harm to the victim survivor. But yes, thank you.
Thank you all for that wisdom and really concrete guidance. To the person who asked that question, also feel free to reach out to us. Our policy team works very closely with a handful of domestic violence policy organizations on housing security for survivors, and we can definitely put you in touch with others that are working on this issue. So appreciate all of those insights. I'll take one more question. This one geared towards Kat. So Kat, I know you do a lot of work all around the country on registering voters, helping people obtain IDs, both for the purposes of voting and broader basic needs. Could you talk about how people in our network can connect with you and bring those resources to their communities for future election cycles?
All right, well, I was muted, but I just put my email in the chat. You can feel free to reach out to me at any time, and we can work with you in a variety of ways. We can talk to you about your particular community organization and how we can help you set up a system to be able to get IDs yourselves, or GOTV programs, or connect you with other orgs or whatever. So definitely feel free to reach out, and we're happy to talk to each of you and figure out the best process for you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kat. Not seeing any more questions, so we'll just jump into some closing announcements. And again, thank you to all of our panelists for sharing about your work and your resources. And I think putting us in the strongest possible position to go into tomorrow and get out the vote with confidence in our communities. So we can jump back into the slides, into our closing announcements. So I just want to remind you of a few additional resources from our Homes Our Votes and our partners. We have a nonpartisan Get Out the Vote call script that you can use to call voters in your communities who haven't voted yet and help them make a voting plan. You can also feel free to adapt content from this for any texts or email or in-person outreach. And we'll drop the link where you can access that script in the chat. We also have our latest edition of Tenant Talk, which is our biannual newsletter geared towards tenants. This edition has a lot of really fantastic content to inspire tenants who might be wary of voting, including some direct testimonials from tenant leaders about why voting matters. And we may have some of you who contributed on the call today. So thank you if you're a contributor to this Tenant Talk and you're in the audience. And finally, as we've heard in our past webinars and heard from multiple speakers today, the Election Protection Hotline is a really critical resource for anyone whose right to vote is being challenged or has questions. 866 Our Vote is the hotline for English speakers, and there are multilingual hotlines posted on the 866 Our Vote website. So there's a number to call for Spanish, a number to call for Arabic, and a number to call for multiple Asian languages. We can go to the next slide. We also have our TurboVote platform, which can be a really great tool for motivating voters and helping them make a plan to vote. I know we've been discussing this in the context of voter registration, and while in many states that deadline has passed, it's also a tool that you can use to help people find what to expect on their ballot. This includes candidates down to the local level and ballot measures. So if you know someone that feels a little bit overwhelmed but figuring out who or what they're going to vote for, they can preview it all here by entering their address. It's another tool to help them approach election day with confidence. And there's also a lot of FAQs about state-specific voting procedures. So definitely check out that resource. You can scan the QR code or click the link in the chat. We can go to the next slide. Around the right side. Sorry about that. So just while tomorrow is election day, this is not the final webinar in our series because this work does not end with the presidential election and other elections taking place tomorrow. We have our final webinar of the year on Monday, November 18th at 2:30 p.m. And this webinar will provide a look ahead to next steps for nonpartisan civic engagement and the housing justice movement. On our panel, we'll have Allison Neswood from the Native American Rights Fund and our own Brooke Shipwright from NLIHC speaking about next steps for all of us here. And to close us out, I will share that we have our network of affiliates, which are nonpartisan organizations, including many of yours, that are committed to carrying out the goals of this campaign. We'll have a post-election virtual gathering for our affiliates in early December. That'll be in a meeting format rather than a webinar, so it'll be a little bit more conversational, a little bit less structured. So if your organization isn't already an affiliate and you think you'd like to attend that gathering, be sure to apply as soon as possible. We just shared that link in the chat. So I'm seeing it's 3:30, time to wrap up. Again, we appreciate all of our panelists for being here. Appreciate everyone in the audience for asking such great questions. Thank you for all of your incredible leadership to get out the vote this week, this year, and every year. And happy voting to those of you who haven't voted yet. All right, thanks everyone. Bye.